Good afternoon or good evening, everyone. My name is Raja Marhaba. I'm the founder of the Jonathan Foundation for Children with Learning Disabilities. We specialize in raising money for psychoeducational assessments, and we also do advocacy, go into the school districts and help parents advocate services for their children based on the assessment that was generated by the assessor. I want to thank you each for coming here and being part of this and taking time out of your busy day. This webinar is hosted by the Jonathan Foundation, and it's currently being recorded, and it's all about mental health and what's happening in our school districts with our children these days. I want to start by introducing our wonderful panelists, starting with Dr. Karen Wilson, neuropsychologist, Dr. LaFawn Gordon, and Dr. Brett Genzel-Derman. They are our team, they are our experts, they are our panelists, and they're ready to answer any questions you may have regarding your children and mental health and mental well-being and COVID and in-person schooling and everything that comes along with that. And I'm going to start with having Dr. Wilson tell a little bit about herself and what she does. And then from there, Dr. Genzel-Derman. Also, I would like you to talk a little bit about yourself, as well as Dr. LaFawn Gordon. And I'm going to hand it off to you, Dr. Wilson.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Raja, for having us on this panel today. I think it's an important topic that we're going to be discussing. I am a pediatric neuropsychologist, and I specialize in the evaluation of kids who struggle with learning, processing, or social emotional challenges. And I'm also the founder of Child Nexus, a digital platform that connects parents whose kids are struggling with professionals like Dr. Gordon and Dr. Genzel-Derman, who can support them in their social and emotional health, as well as their learning struggles. So I'm thrilled to be here, and to be here also as a board member of the Jonathan Foundation.
The honor is all ours. Dr. Genzel-Derman.
Good evening, everyone. I'm really pleased to be here tonight, to be invited to be part of this webinar. This is a really important topic. I'm a clinical psychologist, and I specialize in the area of trauma, as well as psychoeducational and psychological testing. I'm the founder of Innovative Group Psychotherapy. This is an organization that is really focused on helping kids learn about how do you go through therapy in a way that helps you to feel empowered. So we use creative arts as a method of helping them to develop coping strategies and to manage difficult emotions.
Thank you very much. Dr. LaFawn Gordon, can you please tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yes, I can. Thank you so much also for allowing me to be a part of this panel, this esteemed panel, I might add. I am also a licensed clinical psychologist, and my background is early childhood intervention and early childhood mental health. California endorsed as a early childhood and family mental health specialist, also providing services and support for those who've experienced trauma. Most of the work that I do is also related to my organization, and I'm also a founder of Children and Families, Inc. It's a nonprofit organization that primarily partners with other organizations, one being a school district and a large child care program whereby we provide direct services, and we also assess the need in terms of children who have various mental health needs and developmental challenges, and we try to address them with intervention. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to start it off by asking a question, and each of you can chime in as you deem appropriate. First one is, what are some social and emotional factors that impact learning?
Yeah, I would be happy to kind of kick things off. And, when we talk about learning, that's kind of the area where I specialize in kids who struggle with learning. And kids can struggle with learning for so many different reasons. And most of the kids I see, it's because of a neurodevelopmental challenge like ADHD or dyslexia or autism spectrum disorder. But there are also these social emotional factors that can impact a child's ability to access their curriculum and to learn in their classroom setting. And, some that we're probably going to talk about today are impacting children more so over the last year because of the pandemic. And they are anxiety and depression. And I'm sure that my my colleagues will talk about that a little bit more. And, in small amounts, when we think about anxiety in small amounts, it's adaptive and healthy, but it becomes problematic when it becomes excessive, frequent, and distressing. And it's what I often say to parents is that it's very hard to access your thinking when you're anxious or frightened. Anxiety, depression, and some of the other things that are social emotional factors are sleep. And there's been a lot of sleep disturbance over the last year as well. I think they said that, 40% of individuals that reported difficulties with sleep over the past year. And we know that sleep is something that we need in order to not only give our minds a break, but it's a time when we kind of encode our memories, our short-term memories become long-term memories, and we need it for our emotional well-being. And so insufficient sleep can contribute to difficulties with attention, focus, can lead to behavioral problems, memory problems. And so that's another kind of social emotional factor that can impact learning. Two others that I'll just mention briefly would be screen media exposure. And we've seen an increase in that exposure and kind of parents being a little more lax with the amount of time their kids can spend on screens over the last year. And we've seen that when they've tried to kind of push back on that as kids return to school, that there's been a lot of behavioral problems and emotional distress as a result of reinforcing those limits. And the last I would say would be physical activity. Again, there's been a decrease in physical activity for students over the past year. There's been a lot of Zoom PE, which is not at all what they had in the past. And a lot of students, again, have spent a lot of time at home on devices. And we know that physical exercise not only helps physical outcomes, but also mental health outcomes. And those outcomes impact learning.
Thank you so much. Dr. Derman, how does that fit with your practice, with the families that you see and the children that you help?
I think Dr. Wilson gave us an excellent overview of all the different social emotional factors that are impacting. I think I would just add two more, and I think that they would be related to the idea of just we've all experienced a trauma. And our kids have experienced a trauma. And so one of the things that I like to talk about with my clients is thinking about ourselves as kind of snowflakes. Each one of us is different, right? And we've all experienced this trauma in a different way. And we need to start thinking about how that has impacted our learning. And we all have a different learning lens through which we take in information from the environment. And it's possible that our learning lenses have become a little blurry right now, and maybe we need to hone in on how do we sharpen those and how do we look at those. So that would be one issue that I think we need to look at in terms of impacting learning. And then the other one would be, I think, social anxiety. And Dr. Wilson mentioned anxiety, but I want to specifically talk about this idea of social anxiety, because I do see in my practice a lot of youth who are struggling to re-enter. They talk about this idea of kind of social batteries. Their social batteries are different. What they can tolerate in the learning environment is different from maybe what it was like before. The Zoom classes are a struggle, particularly in terms of how they interact with other peers. So now that they're re-entering and coming back, and remember, all of our kids have been in a cocoon for the last, year. And although that works for butterflies and they come out beautifully, we need to be connected. We're humans. And so we've been in these dark cocoons, and our kids have been, a year or so behind. And so they've kind of come out a little awkward, and they're noticing their bodies have changed, and they've noticed their peers' bodies have changed. And that level of comfort that maybe they had before with themselves has kind of been a little shaken. And I think when they come into the school environment again, that can create difficulty in terms of being able to focus and hone in on what they're doing. So I would add that as well.
Thank you so much. Dr. Gordon, like your input.
Yeah, I kind of want to piggyback off of that with the anxiety and the loss of routine in the last year and a half, almost 2 years, where you have a child who's accustomed to, in a family, often accustomed to having a regular, predictable routine. I would say not every child and family, but many. And then all of a sudden we have this disruption of not only the pandemic, but of course, all of the other things that have gone on in the last year and a half. that children are watching what's happening with their parents and how the parent or that guardian is experiencing this really breakdown of the things that they were accustomed to having in a very consistent way. I have to say, I'm also seeing in a lot of the families that I work with this feeling and this experience of grief and loss. Loss of a family member, loss of friends, and spending time with playmates and schoolmates. And all of a sudden, it's the expectation that after going through this loss that you now have to pick yourself up, and not really having all of the tools to be able to do so. And let me apologize ahead of time. You're probably hearing Cody in the background. He doesn't seem to mind about it being a webinar.
We love pets, so it's fine. I have a question now. With all the social and emotional challenges that these children are having at home and going back to school, I've been reading that there's been a lot of talk about making high school students stay in high school another year to make up the year lost. And how does that affect these children? And also, a lot of these children, a year and a half, they haven't been in school, they've regressed. And I'm not just specifically talking about special education children, I'm talking about the general education population as well. How do they deal with that emotional frame of mind when they go back to school and they're so far behind with grades and, they're getting pushed through? Or are they going to be told that we're going to give you another year because you lost a year and you're not ready for college? How do these children deal with that emotionally?
It really depends on the student. I think, kind of applying this blanket, everybody has to stay back a year. I just don't think it's going to serve everyone, definitely not in the same way. And, even though we're kind of looking at it through this United States lens, I mean, for years and decades before the pandemic, students have had, situations like war or, migration impact their learning, and they show tremendous resilience. And I think that we can learn a lot from other countries who have seen, students who've had to kind of step out of a learning environment completely and recover and become what it is that who they ultimately will be. And so I think that we are in the position to provide support for students without holding everyone back. And I think there are things that we can do to support them. And again, there's just been such discrepant experiences during the pandemic. So I think that holding everyone back, again, is not going to serve everyone in the same way. There are definitely those students who didn't access remote learning for almost an entire year. That is going to be very different than someone who was on Zoom over the entire year and may not have, achieved what they could have achieved if they were in-person learning. So I think that we can't kind of have a blanket a solution to the problem of learning loss, which I kind of, don't like that term because, it just, it kind of puts the focus on the learning and having to catch up, which I think exacerbates anxiety for a lot of kids. But I think if we really pay attention to the mental health needs of students, I think everything else will come together for most kids.
Dr. Derman, do you have any tools or suggestions for families and parents to do at home with their children when they are in a loss of learning mode, declining in education, feeling bad about themselves, and facing a possible extra year for those high school students? What kind of tools, and this is for all three panelists, what kind of tools in your expert area do you suggest that parents can have just to give them something at home to work with?
Things that I had mentioned earlier was this idea of a learning lens. And I think before we know what to do, we kind of need to hone in on what does our lens look like right now? So an exercise that I really like to do with families is to have them sit down, and parents can do one as well, and kind of list some of the things that are important for learning. So how alert are you feeling? How safe do you feel in your learning environment? How motivated are you? Thinking about initiating tasks. Is that hard? Is completing tasks hard? How is your organizational skills going? What do you notice are your strengths and that you're wanting to do? And I create a pie chart and I make it really colorful, and we, can have different colors for different things. And then I'm a visual person. And so I like to have something in front of us that we can now talk about. We can have a beautiful lens that's their lens. And we can talk about, hey, where does it feel like maybe it's a little, blurry or a little fuzzy now? Where are the areas that we need to kind of hone in on and focus on? And then as a team, can we work on this together? Because I think sometimes kids end up feeling like, I'm bad, I'm not doing well, there's something wrong with me. But if parents can come together and say, let's look at your lens and let's figure out what are the things that we can do to support you in this area. I notice that you put organization as something that's really hard for you right now. Good for you for being able to identify that in yourself. And now how can we help support you in this particular area or other areas? So that's where I like to kind of start with.
Thank you for that. Dr. Gordon, would you like to give some input, please?
Yeah, I'd like to add that oftentimes the focus is on, what's happening with the child or the teen in terms of their emotional functioning and how they're navigating. And really, oftentimes it starts with, well, how's that parent regulating and how are they processing all of the things that are going on? And so kids typically look to that person, that trusting, caring person. And if they're not coping and if they're not being able to regulate with all of the disruptions that have happened over the last year and a half, chances are it's going to continue to influence, this young person. So I have to say, oftentimes when, for example, when I get referrals for the presenting challenges related to the child, the first thing I have to go back to is, okay, let's go to the parent, let's meet with them, and what are the challenges for them? Because it's oftentimes a parallel process. And so if we can help the parent and support the parent in understanding what's going on, with their child, and at the same time help them in terms of perhaps better coping and managing their time, then we have more of a shot, I think, as far as having this supportive process with parents, and then adding the stronger support and foundation for the child and the youth.
A very good point with the parents, because we all focus on the children, but the parents have also gone through a tremendous amount of challenges during COVID with whatever's happening in their lives. And then they've become the teachers and still continue doing their day-to-day activities, which is more challenging. Because I know in the advocacy world, I've had less parents come to me during COVID because they didn't have the time to advocate. They had so much on their plate that they did not have the time to put another thing on their plate. So they just rolled through it just to get through the process. So it's a very good point that you make with the parents, because the parents need support as well as the children. And if the parents aren't up to par, then how are they going to help their children?
You were talking about other kind of concrete strategies for parents. And I just come to the idea that sometimes parents are always saying, I can't get my kid to talk. I don't know what's going on with them. And I sometimes find rating scales really, really helpful. You can just ask your kid, in terms of, on a scale from 1 to 10, where were you? And sometimes you get an interesting answer. If you're an 8 in terms of how your day was, oh, wow, that's important. Tell me about that, what that meant. Was it, in terms of a bad day or a good day? We want to know those things. Or even coming up with ideas of weather. Can you describe to me your feelings today in terms of weather? Was it raining? Was it sunny? Was it partially cloudy? And then you can get the kid talking a little bit more about that in a way that's kind of removed. So I just wanted to offer those suggestions up.
And yeah, I'd like to piggyback on what you said, Dr. Genzel-Derman, that, all of this gives us information in terms of what our kids are experiencing. And when we have that information, then we're in a better position to advocate for their needs. Because if they're telling us that, they had a thunderstorm of a day, and then they say it was really hard for me to focus in the classroom, well, then that helps a parent when it comes to advocating for your child, because I think that, there are needs associated with the COVID-19 pandemic that need to be addressed through the school and even through a student's IEP. But the school will not know that the child is melting down or reporting high levels of anxiety if they're hiding it at school. And so it's up to the parents to communicate that to the teachers so that they can have it addressed and be aware of that issue as well. So I think, when we think about practical steps, it's taking that information when we communicate with our children and making sure that the educators know that there may be something else that they need. There may be a mental health need, a social emotional need that the school can address in an IEP or a 504 plan. And it's the parents, when they have that information, are in a better position, like I said, to advocate for that with the school.
So I have a question to piggyback on that. The child is not showing any signs of any struggles in school, but then they go home and they break down completely. But then the parent goes back to the school and tells the school, this is what's happening at home. And the school says, well, we're not experiencing it at school. So that puts the parent in a really difficult situation, because now the parent has to prove that, as doctors, how do you show that this child is holding it in at school and not letting it out until that child gets home? And how does the parent communicate back to the school district?
Well, if you don't mind me saying, I have to say that I do a lot of encouraging the parent to be the voice of the child, especially if you have a child who's limited in just because of their age, and being able to really express what it is that they really want to express in their behavior, whatever that may be for them. The parent, oftentimes, I say, is the agent of change. Even me as a licensed psychologist, I'm not the agent of change. They are the expert in their child. Do they need support? More than likely, they do need support, and encouraging them in their role, and being able to give the feedback to a teacher or an administrator that they trust. And I just want to let you know, these are the things that my child is going through at home. And I want to make sure that we have a really proper and healthy bridge for my child, that you may see certain behaviors and you may not, but it really starts with getting that relationship and that building of the bridge between the parent and the school and the teacher in particular, so that they can have more of an active, open dialogue, and then be a part of the same team, of the child. And the child may not have formalized type of special services in school. However, you can have this informal, healthy team of parent, family, and teachers in really working in the best interest of the child and the parent. If we're able to empower them to do that, it would just be all the better for the child.
Thank you for that comment. Another question. Some children seem to be experiencing a lack of initiative, motivation, enthusiasm about learning in post-pandemic. Do you have any suggestions about this, Dr. Wilson?
I always feel like you have to connect learning to their interests. And again, I think coming out of this last year where things have been really challenging for so many students and kids, it's again, that communication that both Dr. Gordon and Dr. Genzel-Derman have talked about. What was the best thing that happened about your day today? And, maybe that was social studies, something that they learned, or maybe it was science, or maybe it was a conversation they had on the playground. And I think getting them excited about things that they have an interest in and tying that to their learning is really key. It can be tricky, particularly with the teenagers in terms of doing that. But I mean, showing that you are interested in how their day went and what they're doing beyond, did you have a good day? Yes, no. opening up the conversation, particularly with kids who may not have the language skills. Tell me one great thing that happened to you today, or if nothing great, well, what was hard for you today? What was a challenge for you today? And then also making sure that the child knows that you are, again, going to be their voice and going to be their advocate. And if there's something that they need that they're not getting at school, that they know that you will be there to you will be there to advocate for them or to help them advocate for themselves in their learning environment.
Thank you. Dr. Derman, do you have any input?
I think this is such a hard topic because what I'm seeing is that so many people, not just kids, are feeling kind of lethargic and kind of lazy and not wanting to do things and maybe not even wanting to take off your pajama bottoms. We're all experiencing that. So I think with this particular topic right now, I think the first thing to do is to really help normalize that experience and talk about how we've kind of downshifted, haven't we, a little bit? Like we used to be running around and kids would have ballet and, volleyball and do whatever. And everybody was running around and we all did it. And I don't know how we all did it, but we are such adaptable people, aren't we? And so what we went through in terms of the trauma was we adapted to a slower pace. Which in some ways is a good thing because we were able to manage that, right? And now maybe even talking about the idea that, we are a little bit slower. Maybe our social batteries need to be recharged more. Maybe we don't want to get up off the couch and start our homework. And we get that. And it's going to take us a little bit. But maybe talking about the things that sound manageable. What is something that sounds manageable to you? Let's look at what your homework is today. What's something that you could do right now? The smallest thing, even if it's just writing your name on the page for right now, let's just try that. Because sometimes when you start something, then the next step maybe becomes a little bit easier. And a little bit easier. Or what's something that we could do now? Doing a body scan sometimes helps kids kind of thinking about and checking in with their bodies and thinking to myself, what do I need? Do I need water? Do I need a hot chocolate? Do I need a hug from my mom? Like helping them figure out what it is that they need and then being able to ask for it.
Thank you. Dr. Gordon, any input?
I have to say, pretty much covered it.
Okay, then I'm going to go to the next one. Why are children not socializing with other children in the classroom? Do you want to take that one, Dr. Gordon?
Yeah, I was going to say that one. Do you mind if I jump in there? The last few weeks, it's been this interesting phenomenon, I have to say, at one of the schools that we provide services. And the request actually was from the staff there is, do you think you all can do socialization groups for our kids? It happens to be one of our most popular services that we do provide. But there were so many kids at this one, actually we have 3 different schools for the school district where that was the primary request because and they were first and second graders in particular. And what was noticed was that these kids really didn't know how to, according to them, socialize. And when you think about it, most of these kids, they hadn't done that in the last year and a half. And so when they're now, and some of these kids, actually some of the first graders, this was the very first time ever being in a school setting in person. And so going there, and the thing that was really obvious was that they're in this classroom and they're with a brand new teacher with brand new peers, and they're expected to do certain things academically, but socially, they didn't know exactly what to do. I mean, it may sound a little strange, like socially they wouldn't know what to do, but as far as this opportunity of socializing in this structured type of setting was something that was really kind of foreign to most of the kids. And that was where they wanted us to start with just the basics of how to interact socially, this back and forth with each other, and doing it in a way where each person is heard was really one of the basic things that they wanted us to do, which we decided to do.
Do you have to comment, Dr. Wilson, on this, or?
No, I just find that so interesting that, you can see kids who spent, like I know kids who spent the whole year of kindergarten in remote learning, like at least half a year of kindergarten and all of first grade, all in remote learning. And then to jump into a situation where you've got all of these other children around and not knowing and having not practiced that give and take in terms of conversation and sharing and, raising your hand and, inhibiting your impulses to go and run off and to the shiny object in the classroom, and having not learned that, it must be overwhelming, I imagine, for a lot of kids to not know what to do, what to say, when to do it, when to say it, and getting all of these nonverbal cues coming in at you and not knowing how to process that information. So I can imagine that, again, if we kind of connect it to learning, it'd be very hard to kind of learn your phonological processing when you're feeling overwhelmed in this classroom that has all of this input that you're not used to and you haven't experienced before.
Thank you. Dr. Derman, do you have any comments?
Yeah, I was just kind of reflecting back to some of the groups that I did over the pandemic. We provide a 15-week group for teens. And one of the things I remember kind of reflecting on is the fact that these kids were not socializing anywhere else, really. And that the place where they were demonstrating or learning about empathy was in these group therapy settings. And they talked about some of the loss, some of the, not knowing what to say. You're on these Zoom calls. It's very different to socialize over a Zoom call versus when you're running around somewhere on the playground, or if you're just hanging out as a teenager. So, I think that there were a lot of different ways that teens, again, needed to adapt and shift to how to socialize in the pandemic Zoom world. And now how do you re-enter and, even boundaries and space between people. We did some in-person recently, and we saw that kids didn't even really know how close can you be to one another. So it's going to take a little bit of time.
Thank you. Another question. What can a parent do about a teacher if the parent thinks that the teacher is the problem in school and not the child?
As a matter of fact, they just had that today. And the way that it, most of the times, and I'm probably have already heard me say this already, having the two come together, getting on the same page. And the situation also happened last week as well, where it was the teacher and the principal was blaming the parent for why the child was not wanting to come to school or stay to school. And there were lots of reasons that really were not at the surface. One being this particular child experienced the loss of her father in a really horrific way. And then the situation that I had to consult on today related to the parent just feeling completely dissatisfied with the teacher and convinced that it's the teacher who was creating all the challenges for the child. And each time it was more like, well, let's see if we can all come together. Same type of thing where the parent has the opportunity to share, hopefully in a safe environment, with the clinician being involved as well, and having the teacher participate, but it being a strength-based meeting, not starting with, we're going to be talking about all these problems. Yes, we are going to be talking about the challenges, but it will be in a very strength-based way where the parent will have the opportunity to share some of the strengths that they see that perhaps the teacher may not be aware of, and then helping the teacher do the same. And then let's talk about the challenges and how we can work together, in the best interest of the child, because the reality is everyone wants the same in terms of the child succeeding, but really trying to get on the same page and doing it would be, the most ideal.
It's very good. It's very important for the parents and teachers to collaborate, because you're right, the best interest of the child, and the child is what's most important. There's got to be some sort of a medium where the parent and the teacher can come together and have a meeting of the minds and see what can they do to make it easier for the child. So that's a very good point. Does anybody else have a comment on this particular question? Why is my child so resistant to attending school, and how can I help him and her go to school? I've had cases where the children are so depressed that they won't even get out of bed to go to school, or an incident happened in school with a teacher or another peer and the child doesn't want to go, and or the child has autism or severe depression or PTSD. This is really difficult, and I've had challenges with these children and the families and the school district as an advocate, trying to facilitate all of this as experts in the area. How do we do that? How do we make it better? How do we ease the pain for the child to help the child want to go to school?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things we would need to know in that situation, in those kinds of situations, is what is the underlying reason for the child not wanting to go to school? And we have to have an understanding, because then we know how to intervene and how to support that child. Is it because for some kids it might be, I don't want to go to school because I have dyslexia and every morning the teacher makes us read out loud. And that's incredibly hard and embarrassing for a child. So if we know that, there's an easy solution. We talk to the teacher, we have a conversation, and that child doesn't have to read out loud, right? Another child, that maybe it's depression. And if it's unaddressed depression, then how do we get that child the support to address the depression so that they can have the energy and the motivation to go to school, but then also address the underlying issues that are contributing to the depression? So for me, again, as in my role as a neuropsychologist and looking through that lens, I always want to first understand the why and the factors contributing to the behavior, which is not wanting to go to school. And then, if this child is in need of social emotional support, then referring them out to the family, to Dr. Gordon, Dr. Gensel-Derman, to kind of help with the transition. Because sometimes the school's not the right fit. And it's, if we get the right school for that child, then we don't have those behaviors. And again, if it's something specific that is happening at school that we can prevent from happening, then we can deal with that as well. The other issue, if it's an anxiety-based issue, some parents will say, okay, well, we'll just stay home today. We'll talk to your teacher, but that feeds into that avoidance behavior, because then that anxiety reduces, the child feels fine, and then the next day comes and the same behaviors manifest, and it just kind of exacerbates the anxiety if we don't address, again, the underlying issue.
Thank you for that. Dr. Derman, do you have any comment or regarding this? Or
Yeah, I would just add that it's possible that when you see a dramatic shift in a child's behavior, that it might be time for a reevaluation. And it may be, if the child had a psychoeducational evaluation, maybe they need a full psychological evaluation now that really can look at some of the social emotional factors that are contributing to the issue. If the child isn't able to get out of bed, we really do need to have a full assessment to really understand that, and maybe have a treatment team look at what kind of recommendations does this family need, in a whole host of areas. Maybe there's some need for community support. Maybe there's need from, school support. Maybe they need, individual or higher level of care. So I guess, I agree with Dr. Wilson. I think the first thing that we really need to do is really get a full understanding of the origins and then create a treatment plan around that.
thank you for that. We have a question from one of the families on this webinar, and this parent wants to know, are there any ideas to compensate for the lack of nonverbal communication that wearing masks creates, especially with children socialization and facial expressions. I think they're used to seeing the face without the mask, and now they have the mask, and it's hard for them to have, cues and to understand what the other person is saying or expressions. And also this would probably be for children that have autism or have difficult time understanding, or children that are deaf because they speak. So what do we do for those kinds of children and families to help them when they go back to school and they're mandated to wear a mask, but the communication is difficult for them?
I think one thing to do, depending on, of course, that school site and the administrators there at a school, really seeing if there is some form of accommodation, in terms of, looking at getting a thorough picture in terms of this particular child and that child's need. Now, of course, because of, many schools in terms of regulations now with keeping the mask on, and then that also puts a lot of the onus, I have to say, on the family after school. The things that maybe you were doing, you may have to do it even more, encouraging this more back and forth communication, verbal and non-verbally, and creating other situations where, of course, in a very healthy, safe way, building relationships with other families and other friends, where you can start to create more verbal, rich environments and other activities, maybe outside of the school, and not look so much for all of the responsibility falling on the school in that respect, especially if the school is having to abide by certain regulations. So I guess I'm kind of saying both, and really trying to build up the life outside of school, but then also it wouldn't be a bad idea, or even just to consider talking to the administrative staff about, there's some things here that we would like a little bit more support. In what way are you able to accommodate this need?
I know with special education advocacy, that's been an issue that's come up a lot. And it's difficult because the schools are mandated by CDC and policies and the powers above that masks have to be worn during the school environment, in the school environment. And then you have children that they may have sensory challenges, and they can't have that on their face. And so it becomes very controversial. As much as you want to help the child, it's difficult to help the child because the school has policies and procedures in place. And then it goes back to having an IEP meeting and trying to come to some sort of resolve of what to do with this child, because in the end, the school has to provide a free and appropriate public education. They have to teach the child, but what format that's going to come into play will be determined during the IEP. It's a very good question, and it's a very difficult question to answer because everything is so new right now. And going back to school, there's been so many changes with what the rules are, and we don't like change. As human beings, we just don't want change. So it's difficult.
Right. And one of those things that could be advocated for, even though we've gone back to in-person instruction for most families, is that this may be one of those cases where you want to supplement in person with remote, because then you can have your mask off and you can be on Zoom and you can see facial expressions, and it may be an opportunity to build on those social emotional skills. There's been a lot of research on social skills groups that have been done on Zoom during the pandemic, and they're just as effective, in some cases even more effective at changing behaviors and enhancing well-being. And so it may be the case where you want to advocate for some remote instruction and remote interactions with peers in addition to the in-person instruction for that reason.
Thank you for that. I have another question from another participant. I'm just going to read it out. Just wanted to comment, actually it's a comment, forgive me. I work in a residential treatment facility for at-risk adolescents who are in the custody of the state. We have recently seen an increase of referrals for youth who are diagnosed with autism because they have become involved with the court system due to truancy issues. These youths are not necessarily oppositional, but are having trouble returning to in-person learning. Maybe the youth seem to have become very comfortable staying at home, isolating and communicating with others online. This is an added stressor on families and seems to be seemingly punitive approach. This speaks to the importance of advocacy. Thank you for that comment. Whoever wrote that comment, I sincerely appreciate it. And I just want to say a little bit about the children in custody. I'm going to refer to children and juveniles, and you're absolutely correct. And a lot of the juveniles that are in prison are unidentified with any type of learning disability, any type of diagnosis. They end up going to jail because they're with the wrong environment, misunderstood or didn't hear or understand the body language of a police officer, and somehow wrong situation, wrong time, they end up in jail. And they're typically normal from the exterior, but they have the, invisible disability, I refer to it, because it's not visible. And there needs to be more done about that kind of situation. Do any of the panelists have any comments with respect to that?
I would say there's a lot of research on the school to prison pipeline. And there are a lot of kids who are who have, like you were saying, Raja, unidentified learning, social emotional struggles, behavioral challenges that get mislabeled as behavioral problems. And then they don't get the support that they need because an unidentified, unaddressed ADHD with dyslexia becomes labeled as a behavioral problem, and they get sent to the principal's office or they get suspended, and then they get involved in other things, particularly when there isn't a parent at home during that time. So I think there needs to be a lot of education around these issues. It's 25% of the population, the student school age population, has some kind of a neurodevelopmental disorder, mental health challenge, or learning difference in their life by the time they reach the age 18. And so we have to find a way to address the needs of all of those students and not just the ones who can be successful in any learning environment that they enter.
I have another question, and this question has to deal with the link that you sent me, Dr. Wilson, and it really stunned me when I read the statistics. It's from Children's Health Magazine, quoted by pediatric groups that stated when it comes to suicide in particular groups, data shows by 2018, suicide was the second leading cause of deaths between children 10 to 24 years old. And that was extremely alarming for me. How has this changed after COVID? I mean, if this was before COVID, I would think that it increased.
There definitely has been an increase. And I think that is why so many of these organizations came together. The American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, the American Academy of Pediatrics, the Children's Hospital Association, all came together and said that this mental health crisis is now a national emergency because of kind of the things that we talked about in the beginning. There have been soaring rates of depression, of anxiety, of loneliness, of trauma, and suicidality, and that data comes from emergency room. A lot of that comes from emergency room visits from kids as young as 5, all the way up until the late teens. And so this is something we need to be focusing on. And, one of the things I said before is that there's kind of been this hyper attention to learning loss and putting a lot of money into making sure that kids get the support that they need academically. And I definitely understand that that's important, but you can't address learning without addressing mental health. You have to, they're inextricably linked. And so we need to be able to address the needs of the mental health of our children, and do it in a way where their needs are being met, and that that we understand and hear what they are telling us in terms of what they're not getting at school, what they're not getting at home, and what they need, because this has been a very distressing time for children, for adolescents, and for families. And, what the pandemic has done is it really has struck at the safety and the stability of families. And that is having a ripple effect in terms of parents, in terms of their stress levels, in terms of their kids' stress levels. And that has manifested in some of these mental health challenges that we're seeing.
And can I echo that? I mean, just in the LA Times, just a few days ago in the Sunday paper, the headlines in the California section, LA students' top concern, ? Mental health. And interestingly, in this field, just over just the decades of this being in the field myself, where we went from mental health being a luxury, and now that we've all, because this is a collective experience that we have all have endured and continue to. So we're now being faced with this idea that, mental health is not a luxury. This is actually a necessity. And we are seeing now more and more attention addressing mental health. In order to even be successful going into school, you do need to have some really solid support in terms of your mental health. And that is one positive, I think we're moving into as far as the direction.
I want to bring up another part of the article that you sent me that really blew my mind, Dr. Wilson. It was a study showed that 140,000 children lost a parent, a grandparent, a caretaker to COVID. And the majority of those children were kids of color.
Mm-hmm.
That shocked me.
Mm-hmm.
Why is that? Why is it kids of color? Why are they suffering so much?
Oh, where do we begin? Where do we begin with that? I mean, I think there are socioeconomic, disparities in our education system and in our health system, and access to resources. And we know that during the course of the pandemic, those people who did not have the luxury of staying home and working from home were, people of a different socioeconomic background. Those were the people who did not, if you worked at Ralph's or Trader Joe's, you couldn't work from home. You had to be on the front line, would put you at greater risk for getting COVID. And if you are part of a socioeconomic background group that is at higher risk for high blood pressure, higher risk for diabetes, now you have a pre-existing condition so that when you get COVID, you have a higher likelihood of dying from it. And so I think that, what COVID did, and we talk about kind of the silver linings, it kind of uncovered the inequities in our system, in not only our health system, but in our educational system. And we have to now kind of figure out what we're going to do about that.
That completely blew my mind when I read that. The statistics are so alarming. You got me.
Yeah, and that also kind of speaks to what, Dr. Genzel-Derman was talking about, the trauma. The trauma for some kids is going to be so significant, because if you are a child whose parent died during the pandemic, I mean, that's a traumatic experience, because oftentimes during that time you couldn't go and say goodbye. When parents left and were hospitalized, no one saw them again. It was like they were gone. They didn't get an opportunity to, again, say goodbye to their loved ones. They just disappeared. And so there's a lot of layers of trauma that came out of this pandemic.
One thing that I wanted to say is to kind of bring us back to something that we talked about in the beginning, which is helping people tell their stories is so important. These kids were alone. These kids were, we don't know what they were thinking as they were coping with this trauma. And so storytelling is probably one of the most powerful things that I can think of when you think about healing from trauma. And everybody has their own story to tell. And I think it's really important if we can help parents to even think about, even though you lived under the same roof with your child 24/7, You don't know what their story is. But maybe now is a time, if you have a little one even, to sit down and find out what's their favorite superhero. You know, they have a story to tell. What's their superhero power that they had that got them through COVID? Talking about having them tell about what was the hardest parts of the shutdown. What were the brightest moments? What got them through as a family? Could help them create a family story that they can kind of revisit, that can hopefully help them to feel empowered. You know, this is something that they can have to go back to, and they may change their feelings about it each time they revisit it. And that's part of the healing process. And we need to hear each person's story. We need to make sure that everybody knows that their story is important, no matter what it is.
Thank you for that. We're coming down to the end of the hour. I thought this was a very important topic, and especially this last statement in question, because it's affected so many people nationwide. This is not a local situation. And this is how I wanted to end this webinar, because I think there needs to be more public awareness and there needs to be more reaching out for these families and helping them. Anybody have any last statements, comments before we end this webinar?
I'd just like to thank you and the Jonathan Foundation for hosting this, because I think that, you know, everybody I think is rushing to kind of return to normal, but I think we're forever changed by the pandemic. And I think there are a lot of things that we can learn about how we demonstrated resilience, how we supported one another during this time, that we want to carry forward as we kind of heal from the trauma of the last almost 2 years. And I just want to kind of, you know, reiterate kind of what Dr. Genzel-German just said about your storytelling. And part of what that storytelling does is it validates a person's experience. You know, this was a hard time. You know, how was it hard for you? And, you know, what did we learn from this time in involving our children in those conversations? You know, I learned that I could be a great artist. I learned that I could, you know, still show gratitude. I learned to help my neighbor, you know, even without seeing them face to face. Like, what are some things that we learned and that we want to continue to do, you know, as we enter this post-pandemic world? And then also realizing that as parents, that we have all that we need within ourselves to be able to advocate for our children and what it is that they need. But we won't know what it is that they need unless we ask them and talk with them and hear what they have to say.
That's an excellent point. I remember raising my children because they had high IQs. I baby talked them, but when they were, you know, 2, 3, and 4, 5 years old, that's what you do as a parent, until I realized they had high IQs and the baby talking wasn't working with them, and I had to address them on their intellect level. And so, yeah, we need to talk to our children and understand where they're coming from, no matter what age they are, no matter how big or small they are physically, because they're just as human as we are, and they need to be heard. So I want to thank each and every one of you for being part of this. If anybody has any suggestions on what other topics of interest that they'd like to hear about, we're going to continue doing webinars. We're going to continue promoting public awareness and just helping families and answering questions as best we can. Do email us, and thank you for being part of this. I really appreciate each and every one of your time and for being here and dedicating it to the Jonathan Foundation. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.